He could buy anything, any house, any car, any room in the world would fall silent the moment he walked in. But there was one thing all his money had never been able to buy: someone who wanted him for the man he was, not for everything he possessed. So he did the only thing he had never tried. He left behind his name, his power, and everything that made people fear him. He became a stranger in a worn jacket, willing to work with his own hands for a hot meal and somewhere to sleep. He hadn't gone there looking for love. He only wanted to know what it felt like to be treated like an ordinary man. But somewhere between mending a fence and sharing a place at her table, he began to find something he had never felt before. For the first time, someone seemed to want him without asking for anything in return. But she didn't know that he was hiding a great secret. The man who climbed down out of a dust-colored pickup at the end of Addie Whitfield's driveway that March morning wore a canvas jacket gone soft at the elbows, jeans that had been mended more than once at the knee, and ink running from both wrists up under his rolled sleeves. The kind of tattoos that told you a man had lived a life, though they didn't tell you which kind. He said his name was Eli Marsh. He said he'd heard in town that Sable Creek Ranch was short-handed for calving season, and he was willing to work sun-up to sundown for whatever she could afford, room included, no complaints. Nearly all of that was true. He was willing. He would work sun-up to sundown. But his name was not Eli Marsh. His real name was Weston Calloway, and from Duluth to the Pacific, men who mattered did not say that name above a conversational volume in rooms they weren't sure were safe. They called him Calloway, the way you'd name a weather system, something that arrived, changed the landscape, and moved on, leaving people to clean up whatever it left behind. I want you to know that from the very first minute, because Addie Whitfield did not know it, and everything that happens in this story lives in the space between what Addie knew and what you and I know. So let me tell it to you properly, from the beginning, the way it actually happened, and not the way the county gossiped about it afterward, because the county got almost none of it right. To understand why the most powerful man north of Denver was standing at a strange woman's gate asking for ranch work, you have to go back 17 years, to a boy named Wes who buried his father in November, ground so frozen the gravediggers needed a torch to soften it, and to a woman named Claire Bennett, and to 4 words Weston Calloway overheard through a hotel door that he would carry, unspoken, for the rest of his adult life. Weston hadn't inherited an empire. He'd built one, brick by brick and favor by favor, out of the wreckage his father left behind. 3 trucks, a warehouse lease, and a debt so large it had gotten his father killed over it in a parking lot outside Billings when Weston was 19 years old. Weston had taken what was left and turned it, over the better part of 2 decades, into something that touched shipping routes and warehouses and quiet arrangements across 5 states, until his name alone could open doors that money couldn't, and close doors that threats couldn't either. Somewhere in those 17 years, Weston Calloway had stopped being a man to almost everyone around him and had started being a fact, a weather system, a door. People didn't want to know him. They wanted to stand near what he could do for them, or far away from what he could do to them, and either way, the actual person doing the standing there in the room stopped mattering to anybody but himself. He had almost married once. Her name was Claire Bennett, and she was the kind of beautiful that made rooms rearrange themselves around her without her having to ask, and for the better part of a year, she had made Weston Calloway feel, for the first time since he was 19, like something other than a weather system. She laughed at things he said before he finished saying them. She touched the ink on his forearms, like they were a story worth hearing instead of a warning worth heeding. He had let himself believe, slowly and against every instinct, that had kept him alive that long, that a woman could want the man underneath all of it. 2 weeks before the wedding, Weston had gone to her hotel suite early, before she was expecting him, and stood outside the door long enough to hear her on the phone with her sister, laughing, easy and warm, the exact laugh he'd fallen for. Scared of him? God, no. He's terrifying to everyone in the world but me, and being the one woman he's soft for is worth more than anything I'd make in 20 years doing something respectable. I'd marry a far uglier version of Weston Calloway for what comes with the name. Those were Claire's words. Remember them, because Weston did, word for 17 years afterward. He didn't confront her. He didn't make a scene. Weston Calloway had learned a long time ago that the men who survived in his world were the ones who felt everything and showed nothing, and so he simply canceled the wedding through a lawyer 2 days later, gave no explanation the papers could report, and never spoke to Claire Bennett again. But something in him had gone cold and stayed cold. After that, Weston could not sit across from a woman's warmth, could not accept a compliment, a laugh, a hand on his arm, without hearing Claire's voice running underneath it, doing the same quiet arithmetic. Wanted for the man, or wanted for what the man could open. Every kindness became a possible transaction. Every smile got measured before he let himself enjoy it. He grew richer and more powerful, and colder and lonelier in almost exact proportion, year over year, until eating alone, at the head of a table built for 14 people, had simply become what his evenings were, and he had mostly stopped noticing it as strange. Here is where Addie Whitfield comes into it, though she wouldn't have remembered the day at all, because to her it was nothing. It happened at a livestock auction outside Bozeman the previous autumn. Weston had gone as himself, as Calloway, trailed by the two men who went everywhere with him whether he wanted the company or not. And the usual thing had happened the moment people recognized him. Ranchers who wanted his goodwill, suddenly finding reasons to stand near him. Auction staff falling over themselves to be helpful. A hush moving through a crowd that had nothing to do with cattle prices. In the middle of all that particular attention, a woman in a canvas coat and mud-caked boots had walked straight past him, hauling a rejected heifer by a lead rope, arguing quietly and firmly with a buyer who was trying to lowball her. $2.20, the buyer had said, not even looking up from his clipboard. She's got a bad hip. Anybody can see it in the walk. She's got nothing wrong with her hip. She's favoring a stone bruise that'll clear in a week. And you know it, the woman answered, not raising her voice, not backing up either. $2.80 or I load her back up and try Miller's yard down the road. And you can explain to your boss why you let a clean heifer walk on a bruise that'll be gone by Tuesday. The buyer had grumbled and split the difference at $2.60, and the woman had nodded once, satisfied, like the whole exchange had cost her nothing more than a few minutes she'd budgeted for exactly that purpose. She'd glanced at Weston Calloway and his little entourage of deference, for exactly as long as it took to register that he was standing in her way toward the loading chute, and then she had gone right on leading the heifer past him, without another look, the way you'd step around a fence post that had been planted somewhere inconvenient. That look, or rather, the total absence of one, followed Weston home to Seattle and stayed with him for months, in a way he couldn't entirely account for. He asked around, quietly, the way he asked about everything. Learned her name was Adeline Whitfield. Learned she ran a small cattle operation called Sable Creek outside a town called Larkspur, Montana, alone, since her father's heart gave out 2 years back, raising a 16-year-old brother on top of it, refusing every offer to buy the place off her, even when the offers would have solved every problem she had. Weston Calloway, who had spent 17 years being wanted by people who had calculated exactly what wanting him could get them, became quietly, thoroughly fixated on the one woman in 5 states who had looked directly at him and seen a person standing in her way at an auction. Will stood on the porch for a moment. Then he followed her in. Because what else do you do when a woman like that opens a door? He decided to find out, once and for all, whether Adeline Whitfield could care about an ordinary man, the way she plainly cared about the ordinary things in her life. A hard day's work, a fair deal, a stubborn heifer worth fighting for, when there was no name attached to him worth knowing at all. Remember that he never planned to hide the tattoos. He didn't think he'd need to. In cattle country, ink on a working man's arms didn't mean what it meant in the rooms Weston usually stood in. It would just make him another cowboy with a past nobody asked about. Weston drove himself out to Larkspur in a plain gray pickup he'd bought with cash under a name that led nowhere, wearing clothes he'd picked up at a farm supply store 2 states over, and told exactly 2 people where he was going. his oldest lieutenant, a broad, careful man named Marcus Reed, and no one else. He gave Marcus one instruction: don't come looking unless the building's on fire, and even then, wait a day. Addie Whitfield was standing in the yard splitting kindling when the gray truck came up her drive, and she looked the stranger over the way she looked over everything on her land: quick, thorough, unsentimental. He was 36, built like work had built him rather than a gym, with a quiet, watchful way of standing that she'd later think reminded her of the barn cats, the ones that had learned the hard way not to trust a hand until it proved itself. "Heard in town you're short a hand for calving," Weston said. "I'm not asking for much. Room, meals, whatever you can spare on top of that. I work hard, and I don't talk more than I need to." Addie leaned the axe against the woodpile. "You got references?" "No, ma'am." "You wanted for anything I ought to know about?" The question landed closer to true than she could have guessed, and Weston held her eyes and answered it as honestly as he'd answered anything in years. "Nothing you'll find trouble from out here." She studied him another long moment. The tattoos, the boots that had walked plenty of miles, the way he didn't fidget under her looking, and something in his stillness must have satisfied whatever she was checking for, because she said, "Bunkhouse is out past the barn. Pays not much. Calving season's brutal, and my brother's got a mouth on him some mornings. You still interested?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then get your things. We start before the sun does around here." And so Weston Calloway, who owned a controlling interest in a bank 200 miles from that ranch and a warehouse district Marcus Reed oversaw on his behalf, became a hired hand on Sable Creek Ranch for $11 an hour and a cot in a bunkhouse that hadn't been properly insulated since the Reagan administration, in order to find out the one thing every dollar he'd ever made had never once been able to buy him. The first thing Addie Whitfield did, on Eli Marsh's first evening at Sable Creek, was refuse to let him carry his plate out to the bunkhouse. Weston had picked it up out of pure reflex, the way he'd seen 100 hired men do at his own properties, without ever once thinking twice about where they ate, and Addie's voice cracked across the kitchen before he'd made it 3 steps toward the door. "Where do you think you're taking that?" "Figured I'd eat out of your way," Weston said. Addie planted her hands on her hips, and her 16-year-old brother, Jesse, looked up from his own plate, with the particular interest of a teenager, sensing that somebody was about to get told something. "Nobody eats standing up in a cold bunkhouse while there's a hot table and empty chairs in this kitchen," Addie said. "Sit down and eat like a person, Mr. Marsh. That's the rule here, and it doesn't bend for hired hands." To Addie, it was nothing. Plain manners, the way her mother had raised her before cancer took her, the way her father had kept the rule going after. To Weston Calloway, it landed somewhere underneath his ribs. He hadn't expected anyone to reach anymore. He ate alone at a table for 14 most nights of his actual life, in a house that had cost more than this entire ranch, in a silence so total he sometimes turned on the television in another room just to hear a human voice while he chewed. And here was a woman, with almost nothing, insisting that a stranger with a fake name not eat by himself in a barn. He sat. He ate Addie Whitfield's plain, good food, pot roast, biscuits gone slightly heavy, because Jesse had been the one on bread duty that week and hadn't quite gotten the knack of it yet, and felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could comfortably measure. He felt like a person at a table, instead of a name at the head of one. So began the weeks of the test that Addie never knew she was administering, and that you and I, knowing what Addie didn't, got to watch her pass without the faintest idea there was anything being graded. She worked beside him in the calving barn night after night, because she wasn't the kind of woman who'd sleep warm while somebody else pulled calves in the cold. She talked to him plainly, the way you talk to somebody you've already decided is decent, asking his opinion on the vet bill and actually listening to the answer, sharing the last of the thermos coffee without keeping count of whose turn it was. Jesse, for his part, latched onto Eli Marsh the way 16-year-old boys sometimes latch onto quiet men who don't talk down to them. He asked Eli about the tattoos once, straightforward the way teenagers can be, and Weston, who had told exactly no one the true story behind any of the ink on his arms in over a decade, found himself telling this kid a version of the truth, that the anchor on his left forearm was for his father, that the rest he'd gotten in years he wasn't proud of, and wasn't going to pretend otherwise about. Jessie nodded like that was a perfectly acceptable answer, and went back to asking him how to tell if a heifer was going to need help calving before she showed obvious signs of it, and Weston taught him, patient in a way nobody at his real job ever got to see, because nobody at his real job ever asked him to teach them anything without an angle behind the asking. There was a day in Larkspur that Weston never forgot, either. Addie had brought him along to help load feed, and outside the co-op, two men in clean canvas coats had looked the stranger up and down, taking in the ink, the plain truck, the unfamiliar face, and one of them had said something low and unkind about Addie Whitfield taking in every stray that wandered off the highway. Addie heard it. Addie turned on both of them with her chin up, and her voice carrying clear across the lot. "This man's done more honest work on my place in 3 weeks than either of you's done in a year, and I'll thank you to keep your opinions about my hired help to yourselves." The two men went red and found somewhere else to be, and Weston Calloway, a man who had been flattered, courted, and deferred to by powerful people for the better part of 2 decades, stood there holding a feed sack and realized he had never once, in all those years, been defended. Not like that. Not by somebody with nothing to gain from doing it. There was the coat, too, and Weston would remember the coat longest of anything. A late blizzard hit in the 2nd week of April, the kind that comes in sideways and doesn't announce itself, and it caught calving season at its worst possible moment. A dozen heifers due within days of each other, and a barn that lost heat faster than the little propane stove could keep up with. Addie, Jessie, and Weston worked through 2 full nights without real sleep, pulling calves, rubbing them dry, getting them onto their mothers before the cold could take them. And Weston worked with a focus and a physical exhaustion that felt, strangely, like the first honest work he'd done with his own hands in years that mattered to somebody besides a spreadsheet. Near dawn on the 2nd morning, Addie caught him shivering in the thin canvas jacket he'd arrived in, snow melting into his collar, and that evening she came out to the bunkhouse carrying a heavy sheepskin-lined coat and held it out to him without ceremony. "This was my dad's," she said. "No good to anybody hanging on that peg by the door. You'll catch your death in that thin thing, and I need you standing upright through the rest of calving season, so take it and don't make a production out of it." Weston Calloway, who owned a closet of coats that cost more individually than most of the trucks in Larkspur combined, stood in a cold bunkhouse doorway and was quietly undone by the gift of a dead man's work coat, freely given by a woman who believed she was handing over the only warm coat she had left to spare. There was one more thing that happened during those weeks that Weston never told anyone about, not even Addie, until much later. Jessie had a calf he'd bottle-raised the spring before, a runt his sister had let him keep as a sort of pet, since it hadn't been strong enough to sell with the rest of that year's herd, and the calf, grown now into an awkward yearling, named, with the particular sincerity of a 14-year-old, Biscuit, took sick in the 3rd week of Weston's stay with a scours infection that could kill a young animal fast if it wasn't caught and treated right. Jessie had come to the barn near midnight, scared in the specific way a kid gets scared when something he loves is in trouble, and the adult in charge of him is asleep after 2 brutal days of work, and found Weston still awake, checking on a heifer close to term. Weston didn't wake Addie. He drove Jessie and the ailing calf 40 minutes to the only emergency vet clinic open that late, sat in the waiting room with a 16-year-old who wouldn't stop apologizing for the trouble, and paid the bill in cash before Jessie could see the amount, telling him only that it wasn't worth mentioning and that Addie had enough to worry about without adding a vet bill to the pile. "You didn't have to do that," Jessie said in the truck on the way back, Biscuit dozing in the flatbed under a blanket, antibiotics already working. "We don't really have money for emergency vet stuff. That's usually a wait-and-see and hope situation around here." "I know," Weston said, and didn't explain further, and Jessie, being 16 and mostly interested in the fact that his calf was going to live, didn't push it. But it was, in its own small way, the first time Weston Calloway had used any of his actual resources on Addie Whitfield's behalf, and he told himself it didn't count against the test, because Addie never knew, and a decision no one witnesses can't be performed for anyone's benefit but the animals. Remember the coat. Remember that Addie gave away her own father's warmth to a stranger she believed had nothing, on a night she had every reason to be thinking only of her own cold hands. It was not love yet, what was building in Weston Calloway through those weeks. It was something underneath love, the ground love needs before it can take root at all. It was the specific, unfamiliar experience of being seen as worth something by a person who had absolutely nothing to gain from the seeing. He could have fixed everything Addie Whitfield worried about with a single phone call, and never felt the cost. That fact sat in him like a stone he carried everywhere and told no one about, because using it meant revealing himself, and revealing himself meant he'd never know. Not really, not for certain, whether Addie could care for the man or only for what the man turned out to be able to do for her. The thing that finally forced the issue was a letter that came at the end of April, the kind of letter that arrives in a plain envelope and empties a kitchen of all its air the moment it's opened. Addie's father, it turned out, had taken out a loan against Sable Creek 2 years before he died. New well, new equipment, a bad year that needed bridging, and the balance had come due in a lump sum Addie didn't have anywhere close to, not after 2 years of scraping the ranch back to solvency on nothing but grit and long hours. The bank gave her 30 days to pay the note in full, or lose the ranch to foreclosure. Addie read that letter at her own kitchen table, with her face gone the color of old snow, Jessie standing frozen behind her chair reading it over her shoulder, and Weston sat across from both of them in a dead man's sheepskin coat, watching the woman he had, somewhere in the last 6 weeks, fallen entirely and helplessly for, face the loss of the only thing her family had left. Weston Calloway knew, without needing to check, that he held a controlling interest in the holding company that owned that particular regional bank. He could ride into that branch office the next morning, as himself, and clear the note before lunch, and genuinely never feel the money leave his accounts. Addie's whole crisis, the thing currently draining the color out of her face, was to him roughly the cost of replacing a company car. He said nothing. He could not say anything without throwing off the entire disguise and risking the only answer that had ever actually mattered to him. That night, Weston paced the length of the bunkhouse until well past 2 in the morning, arguing with himself in a way he hadn't done since he was a teenager burying his father. He had his answer about Addie, didn't he? He'd watched her for 6 weeks. He'd seen her defend a stranger to men who could have made her life easier by staying on their good side. He'd seen her give away her father's coat and refuse to let a hired hand eat alone. He knew, in whatever part of a man like him was still capable of knowing anything simply, that Adeline Whitfield was the least calculating person he had ever met in his life. The test, if it had ever really been a test, was passed, so why not simply tell her the truth, save the ranch, and be done with the whole exhausting deception? The honest answer, when Weston made himself sit with it, was that he was afraid. Not anymore that Addie was like Claire, but afraid of something worse now. Afraid that when she learned he'd lied to her for 6 weeks, let her worry over a hired hand's wages she could barely spare, let her hand over her dead father's coat, all while he could have solved her entire crisis with a signature, she would feel exactly the way anyone would feel, finding out they'd been quietly, thoroughly made a fool of. The deception that had started as a test of her character had become, somewhere in 6 weeks, a trap entirely of his own making, and he understood, pacing that freezing bunkhouse floor, that there was no clean way out of it left. There was only a hard way, and he needed to take it soon, before the ranch was lost and the choice got made for him. Weston was a day too slow finding his courage, and the truth came out the wrong way first, the way these things nearly always do. The next afternoon, a black truck that didn't belong on that road came up Sable Creek's driveway, and Marcus Reed climbed out of it, hat in hand, looking genuinely relieved for the first time since Weston had known him. "Boss," Marcus said, loud enough to carry across the yard, where Addie and Jessie were both within easy earshot. "Thank God. We've had the whole operation looking for you 2 weeks. The Hendricks deal can't close without your signature, sir, and Voss Sr.'s about ready to fly out here himself." Addie set down the fence tool she was holding. She looked at the hired hand everyone had apparently been calling Mr. Marsh, and then at this stranger in an expensive coat calling him boss and sir, like the words were the most natural thing in the world, and Adeline Whitfield, who was nobody's fool and never had been, put the whole picture together in about 4 seconds flat. "Weston Calloway," she said, and her voice had gone very quiet, which was somehow worse than if she'd shouted it across the yard. "You've been him this whole time, sleeping in my bunkhouse, eating at my table, teaching my brother to pull calves, wearing my father's coat because I thought you'd freeze without it." She set the tool down on the fence post with a care that felt more dangerous than if she'd thrown it. "I handed you Dad's coat off the peg because I thought you had nothing of your own, Weston. What kind of man lets a woman feel sorry for him when he owns half of Montana and doesn't need a thing from her at all?" Jesse looked back and forth between the two of them, 16, and suddenly understanding a great deal more about the last 6 weeks than he wanted to. Weston sent Marcus back down the driveway with a single look that the older man understood well enough to obey without a word. Then he turned to face the only 2 people in 5 states whose opinion of him had ever mattered even slightly, and told them the truth, standing in the mud of the yard, with nothing left to hide behind. He told them about Claire Bennett and the hotel door, and the 4 words that had followed him for 17 years. He told them about eating alone at a table built for 14, about being flattered by powerful men his whole adult life, and defended by exactly no one, ever, until 3 weeks ago, outside a feed co-op. He told them about the livestock auction, and the woman who had looked directly at the most feared man in 5 states, and seen nothing more than an obstacle between herself and a heifer she intended to win an argument over. "You're the only person who ever looked at me and didn't see anything to want," Weston said, looking at Addie and not letting himself look away even when it cost him something to hold still. "I needed to know if that was real, and I didn't have the courage to just ask you outright, so I hid the one thing everybody usually wants from me instead, and let you find out the truth the hard way. It was a coward's way of chasing something I didn't know how to ask for honestly. I'm not asking you to excuse it, I'm just done hiding behind it." Addie listened to all of it with her arms crossed, and her jaw set hard enough that Jesse quietly excused himself toward the barn, sensing, correctly, that this was not a conversation that needed a 16-year-old audience. When Weston finished, Addie was quiet a long moment, the wind moving across the yard between them. "I understand why you did it," she finally said. "That doesn't make it right, Weston. You let me worry over wages I could barely pay a man who didn't need a single dollar of it. You let me hand over my father's coat like I was doing you a kindness you couldn't afford yourself. My pride's about all I had left after 2 years of scraping this place back together, and you let me spend 6 weeks of it on a man who could have bought the ranch outright without noticing the cost." "I know," Weston said, "and I'll tell you the truest thing I know how to say. That coat is the only thing anyone has given me in 17 years without wanting something back for it eventually. I don't deserve to keep it. I'll carry what it meant anyway, whether you ever want to see me again or not." "And the banknote," Addie said. "You could clear that with a phone call and never feel it, couldn't you?" "Yes," Weston said, because he had promised himself, driving out that morning, that he would not soften a single fact of it for her. "I hold the controlling interest in the company that owns that branch. I could have fixed it the first afternoon that letter came, before you'd even finished reading it twice." "Then why didn't you?" "Because the second I did, you'd never be able to separate whether you were choosing me or choosing the rescue. I needed to know which one it was going to be, and I was too much of a coward to just ask you outright. So I let you suffer through a crisis I could have ended in an afternoon instead. I know exactly how that sounds. I've had a week to sit with how it sounds, and it doesn't sound any better now than it did the day Marcus drove up." He didn't ask her to reconsider because of who he turned out to be. He didn't offer to clear the banknote on the spot, didn't waive the ranch's rescue in front of the hurt he'd caused as a way of buying his way past it, though every instinct built over 17 years of solving problems with money told him that was exactly the move to make. He simply owned what he'd done, plainly, and asked for nothing in return. And that, finally, was the thing Addie Whitfield could not immediately turn away from, because a man who leads with money is a man exactly like every other man who had ever circled Weston Calloway's own life, looking for an angle. A man who stands in the mud and says I was wrong and asks for nothing is, for the first time in longer than either of them could easily say, simply a person, not a name. "Send your man the rest of the way down the road," Addie said, low. "And then you're going to pack up whatever's in that bunkhouse, and you're going to leave my land, Mr. Calloway, because I don't abide being made a fool of, not by a poor man, and not by a rich one either." And Weston, for once in his adult life, did exactly what he was told, without a single word of argument. He went back to Seattle, back to the house with the table built for 14, and gave Addie the space she'd asked for, because he'd finally learned, somewhere in 6 weeks on a Montana calving barn floor, how to simply do what a woman asked of him, instead of what 17 years of running an empire had trained him to do instead. The week was, by every honest measure, the worst one of Weston Calloway's adult life, and he had buried his father in frozen ground at 19, so that was saying something. He sat at the head of his enormous table and ate in the specific silence he had once mistaken for simply how life was, and understood now, with total clarity, that it was not how life had to be at all. It was only how his life had been, because he'd never once let anyone close enough to change it. Marcus Reed, who had known Weston longer than almost anyone alive, watched his boss move through that week, like a man functioning on will alone, and finally said the only thing he'd ever dared say to Weston Calloway that wasn't strictly business. "Whatever you did out there, boss, undo it. I've worked for you 12 years. I've never once seen you actually alive, the way you looked those 6 weeks. Don't let pride cost you the only good thing that's happened to you since I've known you." Weston didn't answer him, but he didn't argue either, and by the 4th day, he had already started making arrangements. On the morning the week of silence ended, Addie Whitfield was out mending the same stretch of fence Eli Marsh had once fixed on his first afternoon at Sable Creek, when she heard engines on the road below the ranch, more than one, moving slow, coming up her long driveway in an unhurried line. 4 black cars came up that dirt drive that morning, low and expensive and entirely out of place against the mud and the melting snow, and Weston Calloway stepped out of the lead one, wearing the same worn canvas jacket he'd first arrived in 6 weeks earlier, her father's sheepskin coat folded clean and careful across his arm, brought back to where it belonged. "I brought the cars," he said, standing at a respectful distance from her at the fence line, "so you'd know exactly who's asking this time, with nothing hidden behind it. But I wore this same jacket because the man standing here asking is the one who pulled calves with you and your brother through a blizzard, not the one Marcus called Sir in your driveway. You can have the name that comes with me, Addie, or you can send every car back down that road and never see it again. I'm asking plainly, for the first completely honest time in my life, will you have the man?" Addie Whitfield looked at him a long moment, at the line of cars behind him that could have bought 3 ranches like hers without noticing, and at the plain, worn jacket he'd chosen to stand in front of them wearing anyway, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel again after the week she'd just spent. "Put my father's coat back on its hook," she said finally, "where it belongs. Then come inside, because you already know the rule here, Weston, same as it's always been. Nobody eats standing up in the cold on this land. Not while there's a warm table and a chair with your name on it. That hasn't changed just because I know your real one now." That, in Addie Whitfield's way, was a yes, and Weston Calloway understood it exactly as she meant it. Epilogue. They married that October, quietly, at Sable Creek, with Jesse standing up as best man in a suit Weston had specifically not paid for, insisting instead that the boy earn the money for it himself over the summer doing extra work around the ranch, because some lessons, Weston had decided, were worth more than the shortcut around them. The banknote got cleared, eventually, but only weeks after Addie had already said yes to the man in the worn canvas jacket, only after the asking had been done, and answered with nothing on the table between them but the truth. Weston never once let anyone in Larkspur know precisely how the ranch's debt disappeared, and Addie, for her part, never asked twice, understanding by then that some kindnesses were better left unexamined too closely. Her father's coat went back on its peg by the kitchen door, and neither of them ever gave it away again, though Jesse liked to say, years later, that his father would have approved of exactly where it had traveled and exactly who had needed it most. For 17 years, Claire Bennett's words had been the truest thing Weston Calloway believed about himself, that he was a name attached to a man, and the man was simply the part people learned to tolerate for what the name could open. It took a woman who'd handed him fencing pliers instead of admiration, who'd defended him to strangers before she knew his real name and told him off to his face after she learned it, to finally go quiet in his head where Claire's voice had lived, uncontested, for nearly 2 decades. Because Addie Whitfield had chosen the man before she ever knew the name that came attached to him. And when the name arrived anyway, in a line of cars up a Montana driveway, it arrived clean, the way anything does, when you never needed it in the first place, to get somebody to say yes. The bunkhouse stayed standing at Sable Creek long after Weston moved into the main house permanently, and every calving season after that first one, whichever hired hands came through for the work, found the same rule waiting for them at Addie's kitchen table, unchanged and unbending, exactly as it had always been. Nobody ate standing up in the cold at Sable Creek, not while there was a warm table and a chair and room enough